Thank you. Okay, let's see if I can manage this. Great. Whoop. Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to see if I can plug this in real quick. And yeah, it's, you know, little did I know that you guys, when you threw me to the ground down there at the Wheeler's cabin, that you were trying to convince me to come down here. You could have just asked nicely, but no. No, it's good. It's great for me to come down here. It's good to be in Bozeman. You know, I do have fond memories of probably in my younger days of as a graduate student being here for geology meetings, GSA meetings here, and all sorts of wonderful experiences here. And so I hope this is just the beginning of an ongoing relationship with MSU and Glacier National Park. I think there's going to be lots of opportunities, as you'll see as I move forward here. But, you know, I talk about this in terms of navigating the future with all hands on deck. And it feels like, you know, for the past almost 5 years that I've been at Glacier National Park, it's always been about all hands on deck. And let's see, oops, I'll do that. So yeah, it really is an honor to be the superintendent of Glacier National Park. You know, it is one of the iconic units of the National Park Service, and you know, certainly is one of my first park that I've ever worked in that has such depth and history. As Nick mentioned, so much of my background has been in Alaska, where many of the parks up there are not that old. Many were established in 1980, so they're still developing their legacies. But being at Glacier and to learn about the tradition and the legacy that comes from there, the many generations that so many people have connections with is really quite remarkable. I should just put this down. And certainly, you know, I've never worked anywhere where I felt the communities are so well connected to Glacier. You know, and I always like to tell the story of, you know, folks that I know who live in Columbia Falls and literally will drive 20 minutes to the Apgar campground and reserve a site for a week. And it just, you know, at first it baffled me, but then when you see and you talk to them, you know, they're there with their kids, they're there with their grandkids, they want to pass on that experience of spending time on the shore of Lake McDonald. And I think that's sort of embedding that next generation with that national park experience. Certainly, even before the park was established, we certainly know that our tribal neighbors had long history in Glacier as it was their traditional homeland. So, but Glacier's getting very busy now. This photo's not from Glacier. This is actually a photo from Zion, but you know, this is in here just to sort of remind me that, you know, I might sort of whine about just how busy Glacier is, but I got to remember that really so many of my other peers are suffering some of the same issues when it comes to high levels of visitation. This is what it looks like at Glacier. And you know, certainly I can tell you that our landscape architects never designed the parking to look like this. You know, rangers report that sometimes you can see light underneath the tires that are closest to the pavement. Sometimes they say, well, actually I've heard on one occasion that actually somebody got out, slammed the door, and then the car just turtled over. So, and, but it really shows to me just how far we've come in terms of exceeding the capacity at which the park was designed for. So I think that's what it speaks to, but you know, there is so much popularity. Even some of our more rustic areas. This is Bowman Lake, and those of you who've been to Glacier know that it's kind of out of the way, a little bit harder to get to. You know, you got to be willing to sort of sacrifice your suspension sometimes to get there, but even Bowman Lake can get pretty busy at times, and sometimes we have to implement closures of the road because all the parking gets taken up, and it's a one-lane road in with turnouts for passing, and people start parking in the turnouts, and then you can't even get emergency vehicles in. So this is a table I've put together just talking about, you know, what summer visitation looks like, and these numbers all represent percentage percentages relative to the previous year. So in yellow, those all represent double-digit increases over the previous year, and in blue represents double-digit decreases over the previous year. So it's been really interesting. We've seen almost a 40% increase in a 3-year period at Glacier right up until this year. And this year, you know, we're seeing something different, whether it's related to the fires we had later. But yeah, you know, we've had fires for a number of years now. Well, actually, I should say, you know, over the last 4 years, 3 out of the last 4 years, we've had large fires in the park that have had an impact on visitation. They've closed the going to the sun road for various amounts of times. And, you know, just for comparison, I put in Yellowstone's figures there from 2018. Not that I'm sort of comparing myself to that big park to the south, but actually I use Yellowstone a lot as a marker for myself, just because it seems like we follow behind them in terms of what we see. But, you know, the double-digit growth has really been remarkable at the park. You know, and even if you look at that 2018 column, you know, that May numbers were a record for May for Glacier. June was the second busiest June on record. July was the second busiest July on record. And even the August, with a 26% decrease over the previous year, was the 5th busiest August on record for the park. And then September comes out as the second busiest. So, you know, despite the sort of seemingly double-digit decrease in visitation, we're actually on track to be the second busiest visitor year on record for the park, and it's just under 3 million. You know, one thing I didn't mention that I think is also remarkable, not that I'm comparing to Yellowstone, but in 2017, July of 2017, we actually had over 1 million visitors come to Glacier in a month. Which was more than Yellowstone. So that again sort of speaks volumes to me in terms of, I can tell you nobody envisioned Glacier ever having more visitors than Yellowstone. And then this year, even our July, in 2018, I think Yellowstone had 940,000 visitors. We had 905, so we weren't far behind. And so with that visitation, you know, we literally get into that situation where you can't get emergency vehicles in. We have to undertake some restrictions. And, you know, Logan Pass, for example, our visitor use assistants up there will sort of monitor the parking lot. And as soon as, you know, they see cars that are hovering for more than 15 minutes and not able to find a parking spot, then they close the parking lot and just wave people by. So in 2017, they'd had to do that 53 times, which is, you know, seems fairly remarkable in itself. But to me, what was really interesting about 2017 was that we had to close the road 53 times to Bowman Lake as well. And that's pretty remarkable to think that one of the more rustic, more sort of out-of-the-way places actually ended up with those kinds of restrictions. You know, and I've shown this chart to a number of groups, and particularly to the business owners in the Flathead Valley, and a lot of them said, maybe we shouldn't be sending so many people up to the North Fork now. You know, they sort of recognize that they've always sort of, the North Fork's always had this character of or reputation of being someplace, well, when everything else is crowded, go to the North Fork. Well, you know, this slide tells people, maybe not so much anymore. I might also add, you know, show that in the mini Glacier Valley, what was interesting is we closed it a number of times, again, just simply because we ran out of parking. But that, you know, what I first suggested to the rangers before the start of the season was, you know, think about closing the gate if we get too many people. It's a matter of public safety. They said, oh, we can't do that. We've never done that here. You know, what do you mean close the gates? It's never been done. And I said, be prepared to do that, and let's see what happens. And, you know, it was fascinating. We've learned a lot. We learned that, you know, most visitors, when they came and they saw the gate and we could tell them, come back in 2 or 3 hours, they were understanding. You know, I've been told 95% were sort of like, okay, we get it, we'll come back. And I can tell you the business owners in St. Mary and Babb, they've come to me and said, you close that gate anytime. So, which honestly is not a result that I would have predicted ahead of time. So again, I think it's that opportunity to try something and learn from it and find out what the upsides and downsides are. But it's not just about, the number of people coming to Glacier. I think we're also seeing that who's coming to Glacier. And that, certainly when I grew up, Glacier was always considered the sort of not a first-timers park. It had grizzly bears. You had to know what you were doing there. But I think in the last several years, we found that it's all sort of changed. And let's see if let's see if I get this right there. So watch that talus slope right there as I change to the next photo. So there it is. Anybody still looking at the talus slope? Probably not, but yeah, it's sort of that, we really sort of are seeing that selfie culture, even at Glacier. Certainly I've sort of watched the media and known that Yellowstone sort of, suffered from, a lot of sort of people doing foolish things or just, trying to get that selfie. But, we're seeing it too. And certainly when I was in the doctor's office and saw that, I thought, okay, that's not what I had envisioned for Glacier, but that's what it is. And the expectations of what people should be able to do and what they want to do when they come to Glacier has changed. And some of our staff have talked about, we're not used to seeing so many people who've never been to a national park. Literally, the visit to Glacier is their first time ever in a national park. And that's, and as a result of that, we're seeing some activity that, again, we're not used to that, maybe we should be. But, in 2017, we saw, a huge jump in search and rescue needs. And a lot of it had to do with, on the Highline Trail, people would get to Granite Park and think, okay, it's only 4.5 miles down to the loop, it's all downhill, I don't need to fill up my water bottles, I can just, pop down there. We had 14 days in a row, we had to do carryouts for people who were collapsed because of exhaustion and they didn't bring enough water. People didn't realize that 4.5 miles goes on forever and it's hot and it's dry. And so we've had to institute some new programs that we call, preventative search and rescue, which, other parks do as well. But it is just literally having somebody there and literally, like the Inquisition, talking to people, everybody who wants to go on that trail and really, having that contact about what's appropriate for hiking and safety, and do they really know what they're getting into. But I think it's also, what we're also seeing, it's not just that sort of generational differences in who's coming, but I think it's part of an overall, I don't know if to call it an undercurrent or a tidal wave of demand for outdoor recreation that's coming towards us. And I've been told that there are 10,000 baby boomers a day that are retiring in this country, and what do a lot of them want to do? Some want to come to parks, not all by all means, but that's almost 4 million baby boomers a year that are retiring. And there's a reason why the recreational vehicle industry is growing at 10 times the rest of the economy, or that why outdoor recreation now represents 2% of gross domestic product in this country is just that interest in coming to parks, being involved in the outdoors, recreating on public lands. So, what's been the case at Glacier for the 3 out of the last 4 years is we'll have very, very busy. We'll be in the heat of it, of hosting almost a million visitors in a month, and then suddenly those dry lightning storms will show up in August and we get fires. And certainly I think, in the last 2 years, we have seen fires like we've never seen fires before. This is from the Howe Ridge fire that started this year. Historically, Glacier has had fires and has had a number of large fires. I think we've had, certainly, I think it's about 15,000 fires over the history of the park, but about 400 have been large fires. But just in the last 4 years, we've had 5 large fires between Glacier and Waterton Lakes National Parks. And the nature of these fires, we're starting to see behaviors that have never been witnessed before in terms of the fuel types that they're burning in. Some are burning in in areas that had just burned in 2003. And with that, we're seeing some losses. Last year, you may have heard about the loss of Sperry Chalet. This year, we suffered losses. This is the Wheeler property, named for Burton K. Wheeler of the Wheeler Center here at MSU. This is some of the buildings that were lost. This isn't the original cabin, but these are some of the houses that were behind that property. We also, several of the summer owners of summer cabins in the Kelly Camp area were also lost their facilities. We were able to save the main building of the Wheeler property, the main Wheeler cabin, even though a fire had actually started up in the eaves here. If it hadn't been for the smoke detectors working and a working fire extinguisher on the inside, we might not have been able to save that building. But yeah, some of the firefighters who were trying to, I think the metal roof had a lot to do with why the ember showers. They said it was just sounded like rain. It was the embers that were dropping on it. And, but they heard the smoke alarms and they stuck their head inside and sure enough found a fire in the peak of the roof. Glacier and Waterton, have this close connection as an example of partnership. It's one of the earliest examples, I think, of partnership. In 1932, Waterton Lakes and Glacier National Park became the world's first international peace park. And it was through the work of Rotarians from both Montana and Alberta, and just a huge outpouring to convince both the US Congress and the Canadian Parliament to simultaneously pass legislation to establish the International Peace Park. And that legacy is a living legacy and continues forward today. We build on it in many, many ways. One recent example is looking at dark skies. And we do these star parties at Glacier National Park. They're some of our most popular programs. We'll have over 700 people at Logan Pass for some of our star parties. And it's really interesting, they usually start at 10:30 in the evening and it's still not quite dark enough to see everything, but as it gradually gets darker and then people start asking, what is that fuzzy stuff up in the sky? Is that a cloud? And you realize that people have never seen the Milky Way before. And it's really quite a remarkable experience, and I think it's an example of one of those resources or values that hadn't been identified when the park was established, but in today's world really is an example of something that is of scarce value and people are discovering for the first time at places like Glacier. So in coordination with Waterton Lakes National Park, we submitted our application to the International Dark Sky Association and became the world's first transboundary international dark sky, Waterton and Glacier. And so there I am with my counterpart, Yvan Thomas, up at Waterton Lakes National Park. So again, it's a legacy we build on. And another example of how we built on is from this summer. This is Boundary Creek, which is literally what you can't see in this photo. Actually, I've never been able to pick it out. But there's actually the boundary swath that separates the United States and Canada. There's literally a swath of trees that has been logged out to demark that 49th parallel there. And this is the boundary fire that started in late August this year. And again, this started in this spruce fir, fuel type and took off very, very quickly. It grew to about 1,500 acres in less than 2 hours and really took off. But, Waterton Lakes National Park had suffered a huge fire the year before, the Kenow fire, which had burned up almost 80% of their forest that was in the park. And so they were not happy to see another fire headed their way. But this fire did blow up. It did jump the boundary and provided an opportunity for Yvan and I to, probably for the first time ever, sign a joint delegation from the superintendent of Glacier and the superintendent of Waterton Lakes to an incident management team managing the fire in the United States. And so, again, it's because of the relationship we have, because of some of the authorities we actually have through the International Peace Park designation, we're able to sort of take steps like this and do some things for the first time. A couple of years ago, I delegated a fire that was wholly within Glacier National Park, delegated to Parks Canada, and kind of got my hand slapped for that one because I broke all sorts of policy on that one. But people said, well, we got to figure out how you don't do that in the future. But we still work at it. And the last year's Sprague fire impacted the Sperry Chalet. And if you hadn't seen some of these photos of, these were the remains of the Sperry Chalet. Again, it wasn't as if the fire itself didn't burn over Sperry Chalet. It was actually an ember storm from the valley below that blew up. And because the chalet sits right at the edge of a cliff, it's just sort of like sitting at the top of a chimney. And the fire actually began inside the building. Didn't start on the roof because we had sprinklers on the roof, but the sprinklers were completely ineffective in trying to put out a fire burning inside the building. So, but again, it was through partners like our Glacier National Park Conservancy. They literally showed up in my office that next morning and asked, what can we do to help? And we knew with the onset of winter that, you know, those walls, those standing walls weren't going to probably make it, given the snow loads, the 25 to 30 feet of snow that we get up there. So they were very quick to use their credit card and go down to Western Building Supply and purchase, you know, these are all 6x6s, 6x6 by 20 foot long beams that we created this stabilizing structure, which did well through the first winter. The walls did survive the winter in good enough shape, and through the winter gave us an opportunity to do some planning about how do we restore the Sperry Chalet. And it was very interesting. We had several public meetings, and we didn't want to go through this community design process, so we really focused on what's the experience we want to preserve for the next 100 years. Fascinating experience. People said, whatever you do, don't increase the numbers, don't change the dining room experience, because that dining room experience of being served and sitting there and getting to know, you know, your fellow hikers was an important part of that experience. The other interesting one was about the walls inside the chalet. If anybody stayed up there, you know they're sort of paper thin, and you can hear your neighbor, you know, literally just breathing, let alone snoring. And but it was really interesting because it was almost 50-50 split between those that wanted to keep the walls paper thin and those didn't want the walls paper thin. Literally, husband and wife standing in front of me. One of them said, keep the paper thin walls, don't keep the paper thin walls. And so, you know, one of our ideas was to come up, you push a button, one button says, couple arguing. The other button says, couple arguing in German. So, you know, just because that's part of the experience that people did not want to lose. So, but, you know, fortunately, you know, with the help of the secretary, who sort of heard from the public that it was important to rebuild the chalet, and we went through a process. I'd have to say a once in a career kind of process to move so quickly that within 13 months after the chalet burned, we were able to get a design out, do the necessary compliance work, and hire a contractor, Dick Anderson company out of Great Falls, and get a structure built that all we've done is phase one, which is really sort of a core and shell. But boy, it was amazing. I was up there the first day that the Dick Anderson crew showed up, and people just had, you know, the crew that got off just had huge smiles, and they were just really, really committed. And you know, this is a combination. This is kind of a public-private partnership to rebuild this. That there'll be philanthropic dollars coming in to rebuild, as well as insurance dollars, as well as some federal funding to that end. So it's really been a pretty remarkable experience to move so quickly on a structure like this. So, fires, visitation, needless to say, the impacts of climate change. Glacier is really well known for, you know, being a great example of the vulnerability of glaciers in the lower 48 to change. And certainly the species we're seeing with longer, hotter, drier summers that are being impacted, whether it's white bark pine, bull trout, or pika. They're all sort of struggling with that. So, you know, as we sit back and think about the future, how do we think about, you know, all these kinds of changes that are coming at us, whether it's the high visitation, whether it's, you know, fires. I've been asking myself, you know, 3 out of the last 4 years, you know, and all these large fires in the park, is this just a bad spate of fires, or is it just the beginning of something? So there's a lot of research to be done, a lot of work to be done, analysis on what we're seeing. But one thing I'm a big student of, and I've been doing this work for probably a dozen years now, is something called scenario planning, which is something that the business schools often teach about. It's how the business world will often think about uncertainty in the marketplace, and how do you position yourself as a company, a manufacturer, for example, for changing tastes or changing technology, or just, you know, changing exchange rates. So we've adopted this in the Park Service, and again, this is something I've done for, I guess, over almost a dozen years now, to using this to think about impacts to national parks. How do we think about primarily climate change, and how do we think about, you know, making decisions that are good decisions in the face of climate change? And the idea of scenario planning is really about not trying to forecast the future, but thinking about or being prepared for the future. And I often compare this to when you go hiking for the day in Glacier National Park. You often take rain gear in case it rains. You'll take a flashlight in case you get caught in the dark. You'll take bear spray in case you run into a bear. You'll take a first aid kit in case you get hurt. No, you know, you don't know for sure any of one of these things are going to happen, but you have sort of equipped yourself to be prepared. Well, that's really what scenario planning does, is it sort of thinks about it from a climate change perspective, from a visitation perspective, from, you know, we haven't applied it yet, but to think about wildfire, and how do we think about sort of, you know, what's changing around us, and how do we prepare ourselves? How do we think about what we should do differently? So if we had fires again, this is the big question for my winter project, is if we have fires again next year, how are we going to be better positioned than we were this year? So to run a place like Glacier, you know, I have about, at the height of the visitor season, I have about 500 employees that are on the payroll. Over the course of the year, I'll have 1,000 volunteers that work in the park. Through the summer, I'll have over 1,500 concession employees. It really takes an army of staff, volunteers, and partners to provide that Glacier National Park experience. But I often think about, you know, what is that sort of pivot of 1 million visitors one month to having fires and rearranging and closing the Going to the Sun Road the next month. And so I really sort of thought about, how do I help my staff be adaptable and flexible to all of this change? And primarily, you know, in the summers it's been about fire, but it could also be about floods, could be about, not that we're going to have hurricanes, but it could be, you know, a number of other things that could impact the park and what we do. So I really used scenario planning with my staff to help them along so that they can pivot successfully when the time comes, and that's worked out really well. But I think it's, when I started down the road of scenario planning and thinking about parks and thinking about, you know, the next 50 years and what climate's going to, you know, how it's going to change and how can we be prepared, I never thought about how I use it more in the more immediate context on just the organization and preparing the organization for change. So I'm going to pivot a little bit now and talk about something, you know, I've sort of been talking about some of the challenges we've had at Glacier National Park. I want to pivot to something that I think is an example of a great opportunity, a really transformational opportunity at Glacier. And that's our relationship with some of our tribes, in particular the Blackfeet tribe, who we share on our eastern boundary. You know, needless to say, Glacier has long been part of their homeland. They have a deep history here. In the early days of the establishment of the park, the Blackfeet were hired by the railroad to stand there at the railroad platform. So when visitors got off, you know, they were greeted by the Blackfeet in their full ceremonial regalia. You know, and in some respects, you know, you might think this is sort of shamelessly promotional on the part of the railroad, but I've had the opportunity to speak to many of the elders who were young kids at that time, who lived in some of those teepees or lodges behind the hotel. And they actually look fondly back at those days in some respects, because they actually felt like whenever visitors came to Glacier, they always saw the Blackfeet and they saw the park behind. You know, there was that juxtaposition, and they felt that they, you know, had that connection to the landscape that so many of these visitors were coming to see. So I've thought about that in terms of, you know, what does today's version of that look like, you know? And obviously we're not going to pay them to be in their ceremonial regalia to greet visitors, but, you know, what is that thing that sort of helps them sort of think about the park as their place, as something that's still part of their homeland? And so something we started 3 years ago was doing these spring blessing events up on the Going to the Sun Road when it opens. And it really, you know, we don't promote it. We don't. Sometimes we're asked not even to invite the media there. But you know what it is it has to be meaningful for the Blackfeet, and they've really picked this up and have run with it. I always ask all my staff who are tribal members to be there, and you know, when you see 30 or 40 tribal members who wear green and gray all there, and you know, it sort of brings a lot of pride to them, and it's been, I think, very successful in terms of helping our relationships and helping the Blackfeet to feel like, you know, this is their park too. And I think that's opened the doors for new opportunities. And one of those opportunities is this idea of what does a nature-based economy look like on the reservation. This is something that an NGO, the Wildlife Conservation Society, has worked with the tribe and had many meetings with elders to look at, you know, opportunities there and you know, and to look at some of the things that have been lost over time. So central to this idea of a nature-based economy is this idea of bringing back bison to this landscape. And in this case, we're working with the Blackfeet to bring back a wild free-ranging herd in the very northeast corner of the park, northwest corner of the reservation, into Waterton Lakes National Park and onto some of the blood reserve lands just across the border. So bringing back a transboundary wild bison herd to this landscape. And what's really unique about this is that in 1872, there were 10 bison that were taken off the reservation. They were actually moved down to the south end of Flathead Lake for a number of years, and then that herd was actually sold to Canada up in Elk Island National Park up near Edmonton. And there they've existed, and just 2 years ago now, I think, about 95 of those bison were brought back to the Blackfeet Reservation. So from a conservation perspective, those are actually the genetic descendants of those original bison that came from there. So it's not as if we're moving Yellowstone bison into this area. We are actually bringing back the original genetics that were on that landscape. And you know, Waterton and Glacier are part of this larger landscape. You know, I think down here you're familiar with the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Up north we call it the crown of the continent ecosystem. And you know, at the heart of the crown of the continent is Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, but it does extend quite a ways down towards Missoula and all the way up towards Banff. And it's on this larger landscape that we have a lot of organizations that work on conservation issues, cultural issues, tourism issues. And one of those groups is this roundtable on the crown of the continent, which I sit on the leadership team of. And one thing I really appreciate about the roundtable is their focus on sustaining culture, conservation, and community in the crown of the continent. And I think this is sort of a more holistic approach to thinking about, you know, a landscape and how we work on that. But how this applies to an EE is using what I call a mind map, and may take a little wit, but this is to figure out what this is. But this is just a sort of visualization of a lot of ideas and their relationship to each other. And these are all the sort of ideas and benefits and opportunities that come with the INI initiative. And I've arrayed them along the lines of conservation, culture, and community. And I've spent time with the Blackfeet. We've looked at this. We've talked about it. From a cultural perspective, you think, okay, the INI initiative, bringing back these wild free-ranging bison, has a connection to the night skies, because so much of the Blackfeet creation story comes from bison. There's opportunities for, again, that medicine line, that 49th parallel, sort of separates the Blackfoot culture on the north in Canada from the Blackfeet culture on the south. And this bringing bison back that wander back and forth can help, symbolically bring that together. Certainly elders and youth engagement are important, and certainly storytelling and art and song are long traditions for the Blackfeet. But there's also community opportunities here. There's community opportunities for health and well-being. There's community opportunities for that nature-based economy and tourism that come with the INI. And then, of course, as a national park, we're always interested in bringing back an umbrella species to a landscape where it's been gone for over 100 years. That there's lots of opportunities here. But to me, this mind map represents a more holistic representation of a project like an INI, and it gives it so much more meaning. And quite honestly, for Glacier National Park, I think this is more of a cultural opportunity than it is strictly a conservation opportunity. I also chair the Northern Continental Divide Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. So, a lot of acronyms there, but it's we struggle with, I think, on the issue of grizzly bears, I think, from where I sit, which is often at the head of a table of all agency managers who are all trying to execute the conservation needs for grizzly bears. And in the audience, we sit there and are all those people, NGOs, tribes, farmers, community members, stock owners, who all represent those community and those cultural aspects of grizzly bears. And it's really not a very, robust conversation. I think we struggle with it on that one. And, again, it's sort of dictated by the Endangered Species Act, which is very conservation focused and just doesn't sort of have the room in it right now for culture and community. So this is what excites me every morning when I get up, is what progress can we make here? Because I think this will truly be a transformational conservation. It'll be transformational from a cultural perspective for the Blackfeet and for our relationship with the Blackfeet. And certainly has opportunities for economic development as well. So anyway, that's I think one of the great opportunities we have as we look forward. But none of these opportunities are things that the Park Service can accomplish on its own. They're all opportunities that require partners to be involved, and there are a lot of partners. There are a lot of issues. There are a lot of issues to be overcome, a lot of details. But again, if it wasn't for philanthropic partners, collaborative partners, so many of these issues like fire, like wildfire, like visitation, like an E, we wouldn't get anywhere. So that's really why, to me, moving forward, this really is an all hands on deck kind of operation moving forward. So, and again, I'm always looking for new partners, and Montana State may be one of those for me. So I'm looking forward to the future, and just want to say thank you for being here tonight. So I think we have, excuse me, I think we have time for some questions, maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so. And so I don't think we have a remote microphone. So if you want to shout it out, and I can repeat it as well.
I'll shout it out.
Well,
Could you repeat the question, please?
yes. So the question was, do I think cars will be banned from Glacier? And that's I like that question because it's the focus is on cars. And right now, so many of our issues are about cars and sort of the problems they bring with them. But as we've learned over time, it isn't cars alone. Even if we went to shuttle buses and buses themselves, the impact of buses when you unload 20 people and they all want to go on the same trail, there's that sort of loading that comes with that. So we're looking at that issue, but also I'm reminded a lot by the universities that work with us on social science that keep in mind that, it's kind of like Glacier's history. In the old days when Glacier first came around, people would get off the train and they'd get on horses, and that's how they saw the park. Now we've evolved to people get off the plane, they rent a car, and they drive through the park. But I think, I want to keep the door open. I want to reserve my flexibility for new technologies. And not that I'm ready to jump into an autonomous vehicle on the Going to the Sun road just yet. But it could be in our future, and could there be a future where vehicles don't need to park because they're in constant motion up and down? So will it be, will I need to ban the vehicles, or will that just be a natural progression? I want to sort of retain that flexibility. And I think more and more, commercial businesses are interested in they recognize, quite honestly, I cannot get the federal funding to implement a large shuttle system. It would take a huge capital investment, and I'd have, take a lot of new dollars for me to just maintain and run this system. I'd much rather see what we can do in collaboration with the private sector or other sectors of the economy to develop alternative transportation. I have one vendor that's interested in sort of implementing, because there's been so much development of hotels and overnight accommodations in the Flathead Valley, a lot of what we see is day use. And, are there ways to sort of entice people to just sort of, there's actually a program in Yosemite National Parks called Leave the Keys, and again, it's providing that service that literally picks somebody up at their hotel, takes them up to Logan Pass, and would take them back. And they wouldn't sort of necessarily be going on a trail. They wouldn't necessarily be impacting our existing shuttle system. So anyway, we're looking at a number of things like that. Politically, it's whether we have to ban it or we'd rather sort of incentivize people not using them. Long answer, sorry. Well, honestly, I think for me, what's the biggest issue facing Glacier for the next 1 or 2 years? And coming out of the last 4 years, I think is really to get a sense of where are we in this sort of world of wildfire? Why is our subalpine burning so vigorously over? And so, engaging with the science community, academia, the USGS to help us sort of if we really are into this new normal where fires are a regular thing, what might we be doing differently? What can we normalize? What can we not sort of have to operate from an emergency perspective in? Because we know what it's going to be like. So, anything else? Right. So the question was about the wonderful red buses. And yes, I think those red buses are integral to transportation. It's certainly a wonderful historic experience. They certainly do provide viable transportation. And a few years ago, well, actually, I should know off the top of my head, but anyway, a number of years ago, those buses were all but not running. And the National Park Foundation stepped in, Ford Motor Company stepped in to rehabilitate those vehicles and to get them back on the roads with new technology. And our latest concession contract actually includes the red buses and the operation of that. But 2% of the overall gross of those concession contracts goes back specifically to maintain that fleet of red buses. So there is that commitment, and that commitment with today's dollars should mean that we should be able to rehabilitate all those buses on probably about a 15-year cycle. So, yep, the commitment is there to keep them. Front again? Oh, sorry.
In our present political environment, how at risk is funding for our national parks?
So how at risk is funding for our national parks? You know, our national parks actually, generally speaking, are very much a bipartisan issue for both parties. You know, I think historically people would tell you that funding-wise we've done better under Republican administrations than Democratic ones. You know, I think, you know, it's sort of what I hear in these debates about public lands in general. National parks kind of represent such an extreme end of that spectrum of public lands because they are recognized for the unique qualities, the significant values that they represent, that I don't think there's a whole lot of debate of not taking care of them. And I think there's been a lot of effort put to how do we maintain them, because national parks are infrastructure heavy. Of all our public lands that we have in this country, national parks have the most in terms of historic structures and visitor facilities, roads and otherwise. And I think there is a pretty big commitment from both sides of the aisle to take care of our national parks. You know, they're certainly huge economic drivers, you know, as we've heard in the news lately, you know, the billions of dollars that come to Montana from our visitors, as well as the billions of dollars that come from our Montana residents associated with our public lands. So, yeah, and national parks are a big part of that.
Yes, I've worked in Yellowstone, and my observation and opinion is that the motives of the concessionaires in the park are quite different from the mission statement of the National Park Service. So what are your thoughts about expanding the National Park Service for the National Park Service that basically take the parks back? And my second question would be, with the growth trend seems to surprise everybody by how quickly it has happened. What would your thoughts be about actually closing a national park for a year or two to actually catch up?
So question one is about concessions, and the sense that, you know, concessioners being in the for-profit business may not line up well with the national parks mission. And again, I think as national parks as established, actually before, you know, there were national parks, many of them were developed privately. And, you know, Congress didn't see, you know, I think was set out to strike that balance between what's that private development and what's that sort of maintaining them into the future. I can tell you one thing, you don't want the National Park Service to be running hotels. That is not, you know, I don't think that's a good role for a government agency, is to provide those services. So I think at some level, there always has to be this public-private partnership on that. Now, you know, could we do a better job? Perhaps, you know, but I gotta tell you, you know, at Glacier, you know, if it wasn't for the concession and the way these contracts are written, that, you know, taking care of the Many Glacier Hotel, taking care of Lake McDonald Lodge, taking care of Village Inn, taking care of Rising, I mean, it is just a huge burden off the federal budget that these historic facilities are being taken care of. And, you know, sometimes it is with a little kicking and screaming, but I think the concessionaires are actually doing a pretty good job of taking care of the red buses, I think is something they're doing. And with that, I've completely forgotten what your second question was. Oh, yes.
It's basically resting the parks. I mean, especially for Yellowstone. When do you know, 4.5 million this year, 5 million next year, 6 million. The footprint is becoming heavy. I've read a report recently in the Yellowstone Quarterly where even the wilderness areas, you know, everybody advertises everything on a social network. That, you know, there are very few secrets left, so there's even an impact on the vegetation of the wildlife in the wilderness.
Yeah, and I honestly, I'll avoid speaking to Yellowstone's case. You know at Glacier, we do have a very strictly managed backcountry reservation system, and I think from a backcountry perspective, we're not feeling that as much. But I think the question becomes, with this visitation, with so much of it, and we're not restricting it, is on what we call the front country, which are along the main roads and those trails that are immediately adjacent to those heavy use areas. And we are wrestling with that one. We are definitely wrestling with how do we sort of reduce the impacts or try to minimize. And actually we are starting some studies to look at what is that sort of impact from just a conga line of hikers on the trail to wildlife just wanting to get across the trail and move from one part of the habitat to another. So those are things we're looking at, and actually for those of you who were in Many Glacier much of the summer, we closed several of our trails just because it was obvious that it was becoming an impediment to wildlife in that situation. So, but with visitation, it's kind of like squeezing a balloon. It sort of squeezes out somewhere else. So, but I don't think that's a conversation that I, as a superintendent, can make by myself. That's a conversation that is about when do we strangle the goose that lays the golden eggs, and that's I need that community support. I need a lot of support to say yes. It's important for us that we preserve this for the long term, and therefore we need to make some of those sacrifices. So that is out there. So one more question.
Are you going to get any more ranger dogs?
Any more service dogs was the question. She called it the ranger dog. Gracie, the bark ranger, of course, has been quite popular. But we are turning to service dogs more and more. And one of those areas is aquatic invasive species. I just received a grant that I've sort of worked through and working with a number of parks to bring. Actually, Tobias is the service dog with Working Dogs for Conservation. We'll be making a circuit through some of our parks in the Northern Rockies, both from a demonstration, but also to bring public attention to the issue of aquatic invasive species and the risk they pose, particularly to those river basins that aren't impacted, like the Columbia River Basin. So, Gracie was a fascinating experiment, completely funded through our philanthropic partners. All her training was funded by them and has proven incredibly effective when she's around. I mean, the sheep automatically, our rangers get tired of waving, honking horns, rattling, whatever, even firecrackers, because the sheep and the goats just completely ignore that, or have gotten habituated to the point that they just really ignore it. But as soon as they see that dog, it's just that instinctive reaction that they have, and they move off. So, anyway, I'll be around for a few more questions. But again, thank you so much for coming tonight and learning more about Glacier. And I hopefully I can come back in next year and give you an update on where we've gotten. So, thank you.